Welcome to Diesel Engine Essentials. My name's Amanda and I'm currently in New Zealand. I grew up as a sailing kid and raced around the world and also ran expeditions for 30 years. And welcome to the Toronto Boat Show. I'm excited to be presenting two seminars at the show, this one diesel engines, and I'll also be doing anchoring techniques, Great Lakes to worldwide. I'm currently in Opua, which is in Northland, New Zealand. I live on my yacht, Julie. That's where I'm recording from, and it's quite stormy outside, so bear with. And she is located across the waterway from Great Escape. So I teach at a sailing school where you can charter boats and learn sailing, also take the boats out, and then work on the Opua car ferry as a deckhand and training skipper, keeping busy. So I kayak to work, which is pretty awesome. Don't have an engine on my kayak, but Julie Boat certainly does, and we'll see her in the show. For Great Escape, the boats have engines and outboards, and 3 of the boats have engines. So I get to skipper those boats up and down the coastal waters. So I need to know exactly what's going on with the engine, being the skipper, in case something happens. The beginning of last year, I also ran 6 expeditions on a Garcia 45 in the Straits of Juan de Fuca. And for the last, previous to that, for the last 30 years, I did worldwide global expeditions on a Helbergrassi 46. You'll also see that engine in this show. In 2000, I wrote The Essential Galley Companion, but definitely want to be out of the galley. The book was normally, I was a rigger and sailmaker by trade, but the book was reissued last year. And so it's also available on Amazon.com. Well, 2 up in the engine really help to have a backup for what you're doing. So the more you and your partner or a friend or anyone who comes along can share engine woes and stories or help out or just troubleshoot is really key, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I have a handout for the seminar. You can download it from the Toronto Boat Show website, and also Great Escape Sailing in New Zealand will be posting it. So that's a 2-page handout that really outlines key points from this seminar. That's what I'll be following along with. Well, the objectives, quite a few, but the first up is that understanding 6 engine systems. I think there's 6. So that's what I've decided. Putting this seminar together, I want to try and make it as clear as possible. If you get these 6 systems down, you pretty much understand how engines work. Starting up and operating procedures for engines are key. Maintenance you can do, when you need to hire a mechanic, and environmental matters, taking care of the environment. And most of us don't have the luxury of getting a new engine. So what does it take to evaluate an old engine, and when do you need to repower? How much are you spending on it? And we'll talk about that at the end of the seminar. Well, I'm not the guru. Nigel Calder has written an amazing book called Marine Diesel Engines, and he is pretty much the guru on engine systems. This manual will take you right through from troubleshooting, maintenance, repair, as it says on the cover. Brilliant. But if you're new to engines, want some colored diagrams, some pictures, some clearer explanations, then Pat Manley's book, Diesels Afloat, is also excellent. So I keep using reference to both these books, and you'll see references throughout the seminar, and I've noted where I've referenced those. Along with a book written specifically for diesel engines, you'll have the parts manual for your engine, the operator's manual, and not necessarily the service manual, but your mechanic or somebody should be able to get access to that. With your engine, you want to know what model it is. So they often produce a set base for the engine and then add different components. So if you do know what model number it is, that's really helpful. You can download some of these parts catalogs from the internet, but if you're a cruiser or sailor, it's really nice, or if you're cruising offshore for a long term, it's really nice to have a paper copy of those. The next thing you want to do with your engine is have an engine hour meter. So this just ticks over when the engine's running to record how many hours the engine has been working, or operating, basically. From that, we do an engine log. So this is just done on notepaper, or you can do it in a proper book. So we often do, or we do the distance the boat's traveled, the date. If you're traveling offshore or long-term places, we probably put the location, the hours the engine's been running. And from then you can go back and determine your fuel burn. So when you last topped up your fuel, now what rate she's burning fuel. If you have a fancy boat, you want to protect your interior. lay down a sheet or a set carpet or anything, or even on my boat here, Julie, we roll the carpet up. So I'm just down to the floorboards. I'll lay down some towels or some working block paper if I'm spending a long time in the engine room. It's nice to have a workbench. Don't have the luxury of a separate workbench in the engine room, so I use my countertop, lay down some clear vinyl so I can place items on top of that. Also do newspaper as well. Protecting yourself along with your interior, so eyes and ears. Oh, and here I've been in the engine room without gloves, so that's probably is not a good thing. We'll talk about what I've found in the engine room later. But I have 3 sets of gloves, really light latex dexterous gloves, medium gloves, and then heavy duty ones if something might be hot, or if I'm picking up something really slimy or doing some heavy duty work. Have a dedicated toolbox, not necessarily for the engine, but try and have as many tools as possible so I can work on the engine. I'm cruising in foreign ports and foreign places when I deliver boats and things, so it's really nice that I have a good toolkit on the boat. Often in a funky place, a mechanic may just come down with a hammer, and not a good thing. Well, keeping an engine clean and rust-free and have it freshly, well, not necessarily freshly painted, but having it painted if you can, certainly avoids, well, you can detect what's going wrong with the engine if it's looking really bright and shiny rather than something that's rusting and corroding in places. So get in there with paper towels, simple green, some product that is environmentally friendly, and just wipe the engine down. You can also see where the dust from the belts is going. You can see where drips are forming. And a white engine will definitely tell you what's what. We'll talk about the color coding of items on the engine later on. So you'll know that oil's brown, you'll know that coolant's green. So if you start seeing drips that are color coded, you might have a better chance of figuring out what's leaking or where things are coming from. So this yacht had a Burke engine and it's normally red, but they had it painted white before it was being installed. So they've just done a repower. What does an engine do? Well, a diesel engine converts fuel into energy in the form of torque and electricity. Torque being the forward movement. Electricity is kind of key because most of us are using the engine for long-term boating to charge our batteries, as long as going forward. Learning the parts of an engine can really help out your mechanic or just troubleshooting. Then you can go to your manual, you know what's up, what's where things are supposed to go. So learn the basics first. When I was first starting out, I labeled the engine parts because I was basically trying to figure out what the systems were, where everything went. So it really helped. No, the labels aren't going to stick because they're going to fall off into the bilge, but even just getting them with tape and a marker, I downloaded a lot of engine systems from different companies and then would trace through the cooling and the oil and the fuel. Well, these are the systems. Fuel system, I relate to food. The electrical system, brains of the engine, what makes it tick. Cooling, you can't overheat an engine, so I relate to hydration and sweating, and these I relate all to the human body. Lubricating system, bloodstream. Engine needs air and we need to breathe. And transmission is the forward movement or reverse or the actual movement of the engine and getting your boat through the water. Well, pretty much like the human body, an engine needs good fuel. So I'm fueling up here in Acapulco. We are at a high-end marina. So we hopefully, with the big swanky boats, that the diesel fuel's really good. Yeah, there's a cheaper place further over and a guy can bring fuel out in drums. But if it's going to go through the pumps, a lot of fuel, if it's pre-filtered into those tanks that the fuel station has, really want to check that you've got a good source. Your fuel is going into a tank. So then you want to make sure that your tank is in top notch. If you take off the inspection port, pump out the fuel, there may be a sludge in the bottom of your tank. Unfortunately, the gasket fell into this tank when I did that. So it was pretty hard to get a photo, but if that black gunk can get caught into your filters, not a good thing. So the tank needs to be inspected. If you're buying a new boat or if you haven't used your boat for a while, you're not too sure how much sediment's in the bottom of your tank, definitely want to be able to inspect it. Here is a scenario I found on the internet of an Alberg 37. So they've got sludge into their tank that all has to be removed, but so much so that they actually took the tank out and replaced it. It was corroding from the inside. Well, you can pump the fuel out yourself. This will take a fair amount of time, but you can also get a system or hire a company called fuel polishing. They'll come to your boat, take out all your fuel, run it through good filters, high micron filters, and then put it back in your tank after they've inspected your tank and cleaned out your tank. That picture was in the Pacific Northwest. This is in the Med. So this is a van that also comes, fuel polishing service. Picture of a tank from Nigel Calder's book. And what we have on not necessarily high-end engines, but what you really want to know is that when the sediment's falling into your tank, if you have a sump is a really nice idea. So some high-end boats, pretty much like airplanes, have a sump, and you'll pump out the very bottom of the tank. You can also install a sump pump yourself. So it's basically pumping out by hand anything from the bottom of the tank after your fuel, because the sediment will set, and then you can tell the quality of the fuel in your tank. Sump pump. Little brass pump sucking out the fuel, putting into a jar, and you can inspect that and say, hey, is our tank looking good? Here's that brass pump plumbed into the bottom of the tank. A few pumps of the handle will determine if your fuel's good. Pre-filtering your fuel, if you're not too sure. So here's some chaps in Mexico have come along and hey, swapping beer for fuel. And they've got an electric pump there. He's got a plugging in a power cord, pumping it into your boat through a filter called Mr. Funnel. This will separate the water that's in that fuel from the fuel. So there's two mesh screens in it. You can see the container on the right is the captured water. The trouble with water in your fuel is that it can hold and grow bacteria, fungi, and yeast. So the water is a breeding ground for those items. Or you can kill them or add an additive to your fuel. So you'll purchase these, put it into your tank, and that will kill the microorganisms, the fungi, the bacteria that lives in the water that's in the fuel. Practical Sailor recommends that you alternate brands, so don't just stick with one brand, that the different brands will kill different kinds of microorganisms or whatever it is that's growing in your water. So switch it over. The fuel system we talked about comes into your tank, and then it is pumped through your engine. And I've colored it in. So it leaves your engine through a valve, pumped into your primary filter, then into through your engine, the injectors. And not all the fuel gets used up in your engine. Some of it may return to your tank or back to your primary filter. Well, I'm into color and into systems, so I've designed a coloring in book for engines, and you can color in each system and work through it. That's available for $10. Andrea is a school teacher. She did all the drawings for the coloring in book and had never seen her engine, or never really knew much about the engine on her boat, but after creating a coloring in book, she became quite an expert. So for example, here's the fuel system from the coloring in book in yellow. Proceeds of the book go to schools and education schools and throughout the world. Back to our fuel system coming from your tank through your primary, which we call generally your ray coil filter, because you can see the bottom of it and sight if there's any water in your fuel, through the injectors and back into your tank. A breakdown of your Yanmar. If you have a Yanmar, you can go to your owner's manual, and then here's a breakdown of those parts. So if you have a problem in any of those areas, it's a very detailed section cut through or diagram of it leaving the tank, coming through your fuel injection pump, fuel injectors, and then the return back to your primary filter. Your primary filter has a water separator, so it's capturing the water before it gets into your engine. with a sight bowl on the bottom so you can actually see that level. You replace the cartridge in it, so there is a filter. And when you do that, top up the fuel chamber with clean fuel before you put the lid down. So don't leave it empty. Secondary fuel filter is on the engine. And it is also filtering the fuel that comes through your engine. 4-cycle engine is most common. So diesel takes in air into the chamber. The piston comes down and sucks in air through the intake valve. That air then gets compressed because there's 2 valves at the top of that chamber. So air gets compressed as the piston comes around. At the same time, fuel gets injected into the top of the piston, and that fuel mixing in with warm air causes an explosion and drives the piston back down again. The valve opens up and it vents on the next stroke through. So intake, compression, injection, the power and exhaust. And this is happening at 2,000 revs per minute. So it's going super, super fast to drive your engine. Here's a 4-cylinder engine. My engine on my boat is a 2-cylinder engine. Fuel injectors are injecting fuel into that chamber, and they need to be inspected and make sure that they are spraying in a perfect spray pattern. So that's something you can't do yourself. Injectors are taken out, sent away to make sure that they're spraying so that that air gets compressed and that right amount of fuel is spraying into the piston chamber. So every 1,000 hours on my previous Volvo, and the injector nozzles were sent away for servicing. Put them back in with Never-Seez or some really good anti-corrosive compounds so they don't actually get stuck into the top of the engine or the side of the engine, wherever they're placed. The second system for the engine is the electrics. That's the brains of the engine. Not a lot you can do yourself, but that's taking care of your starter motor, making sure the engine starts, the alternator that's powering your batteries. And most often it's the alternator bracket, so the tension of the belt that drives over the alternator, that's key to happy management of your charging systems. You can get custom brackets made, pays to have a spare, pays to really sort of understand the importance of belt tension and how you achieve that with your alternator. 2 types of belts. Traditionally, we used V belts, which are kind of a deep, thick rubber belt. And that's been switched to a micro V, which is little serpentine belt. So it's like more like a snake with little ridges rather than just one big V. 1/2-inch deflection is how much belt tension you want on the traditional V belts. And then on the new serpentine belts, a 90-degree twist. So you just want to be able to twist at 90 degrees. You don't want the belt too slack or too tight. Here's not a very good scenario. They've done a high output alternator on this engine. So this alternator requires really good consistent belt tension. If it's too tight, you're going to put a lot of pressure on your freshwater circ pump and it's going to not perform too well. Or if you get belt slippage, you're going to burn out your alternator. So it's not really a good idea to drive a high output alternator with just one belt that's running over your freshwater circulation pump. A better option is to leave the existing belt that's on your engine running over the small alternator that you can see here on the right. That is charging probably your engine starting battery. Put a double pulley on the front of the engine, run 2 belts to your high output alternator. So that basically those 2 systems are running independently for those 2 alternators. And then the original one running over your freshwater circulation pump. Regulating the amount of voltage that's coming out of your alternator. So when your engine first starts up, it'll run, then it'll really put a lot of power into your batteries and then taper off as your batteries start to get full. So having a pretty much a smart voltage regulator is a good idea. On our expedition boat, we carried a spare alternator because it's just much easier just to take it out, bolt a new one on than trying to problem solve if it's not charging and what's happening. So belt tension being the key to having the alternator working. But if that's not key, then you can quickly burn out an alternator. On the Garcia expedition boat, same thing happened again, but carrying a complete spare means you can take one unit out and place in a new unit. The third system for the engine is the cooling system. And there's two of these on a diesel engine. The raw water system comes in from the lake or from the ocean, and it is keeping the engine cool because it's running through it, cooling the head of the engine, and then coming out your exhaust. Water comes in from the ocean or the lake through a strainer. It is pumped through the engine, through the head of the engine, and then out the exhaust, also helping keep the exhaust elbow cool. Now that exhaust elbow will come back to in a few minutes, certainly if you have a Yamaha engine. You want to make sure that the intake for the engine has a grill over it, so this one doesn't, and that it's free of barnacles, so you get maximum intake into your engine. So here we have through hull intake strainer, so this is covering the intake for the engine. A valve as it enters the engine, so you can then shut it up if you're inspecting the system. The strainer basket can be plastic or bronze, depends on who's installed it. And then that basket gets taken out every 6 months to a year, just scrubbed with Jif, making sure it's clean. Certainly if you've been through an area where there's lots of floating debris in the water. The raw water pump is on the front of the engine. And it is helping pump that cooling water, raw water, through your engine. It's kind of nice to have it relatively easily accessible. Inside that pump, you want to inspect the impeller. And generally every 300 hours, depending on your engine make and model, but certainly replace it annually. The impeller is squished in sort of one direction so that it actually works as a pumping flow through the engine and has little nodules on the end. But what can happen is that you get cracks in the vanes of the pump impeller, and then they get pushed further on into the engine. So if those vanes were to rip off, they get shoved further inside the working parts of the engine. It can also end up in your heat exchanger. So this is what's helping your engine stay cool. So that needs to be serviced every 10 years. Here's a cutaway image of those cooling tubes that run through the head of the engine. Those vanes can also get pushed further into your engine to your oil cooler, which also needs to be serviced every 10 years. So you undo it, take it apart, send it away to someone, and they pressure test it, make sure it's all clean, blow it out before you put it back on your engine. When you replace the impeller, you can grease it with Vaseline, which you can see slightly around the top of this engine, and then hold it, the vanes over and bent with a wire grip, a zip tie, wire tie, and then place it inside your electrical tie, and place it inside the housing for that. On the expedition boat, we carried a complete spare water pump. So once again, if the water wasn't coming through the engine, pretty much like the alternator, we could take that pump off and then put on a new one. So we've talked about the raw water system coming in from the ocean. Then there's a separate system called your cooling system, which is your fresh water that is circulating around your engine, pretty much like your car. You want to check the level of the coolant. Here we have a reservoir that sits outside. On my diesel engine, I have to open up the cap and make sure that there's coolant inside, so I don't have a separate reservoir. The coolant is an additive, and you need to replace it every 2 to 3 years because its anti-corrosive properties get used up. So it sort of has an expiry date. You're mixing it with some water, but the properties that are in your coolant help keep your engine, it helps, it goes through your engine and stops it from corroding. You have a freshwater circulation pump. So this is pumping that coolant just around and around inside your engine. Check it for drips. So if it's slowly dripping, you'll need to take the faceplate off, check your seals, and it should be dripping green. The lubricating system is the oil system of your engine. So you want to have oil run, definitely have oil running through it. It's inside, captured inside the engine. You're checking the oil level because it does burn a little bit of oil, and then totally changing out the oil. Dipstick allows you to check the oil level. And a dipstick has some notches and marks on it. So there's a high level of oil, and then if that oil is running low, it'll show low. So whenever you start your engine, before you start your engine, check your dipstick and you're checking the oil level. Depending on your engine, you're changing changing all the oil completely out of your engine, sucking out the old one, sucking out the old oil, putting in fresh, clean oil every 100 to 500 hours. It's a little bit of a messy job because you're trying to suck it out from the bottom of the engine. So it's a good idea to, if you can, have space to put in an electrical pump. Reverso does a really nice little pump that you mount with that hose into your engine, and it sucks it out completely. Just flick a switch. With your oil system, there's an oil filter, so the cartridge gets taken off. Here we're dumping it into a Ziploc bag because it's side mounted, so it gets to be kind of messy, and then you can replace the cartridge. So there's actually the fill filter, but anyway, you drop that cartridge into a bag and then place on the new one. Oil cartridge on a Westerby engine. The oil filter on a Cummins, so it's nice and large. It's possible to do an oil analysis, so you can take a sample of that used oil and send it away, and they'll sort of test, they will test it for properties and contaminants. And if you keep a record of what you've had over the previous years, you then sort of have an idea of what the wear pattern may be in your engine. So if it's showing up something such as potassium, if there's extra of that, or extra zinc, or extra magnesium, you can sort of get an indication of how your engine's wearing. Fifth system of the engine is air. So diesel engines need lots of fresh, clean air. Air filter on some engines, so that keeps it relatively simple. The transmission is similar to that of your car. It takes energy from the engine to make the boat move forward or in reverse. For larger engines, there is a transmission. This one has a oil in the cooler as well, so it's a hydraulic transmission. Automatic transmission fluid is pink, so if you've got pink drips under your engine, you know that it's leaking. If salt water enters that fluid, it's going to turn like a strawberry daiquiri. It's going to not be good. So if you do see strawberry daiquiri in your automatic transmission fluid, you know that you've got saltwater leaks. The propeller, don't forget to grease your propeller if it requires greasing. Some of the modern propellers definitely require a lot of grease inside so that they can change the pitch or open and close if it's a cam or a squid-like impeller that then opens when it spins. So this blade switches for reverse and forward, but it does require greasing probably 3 times a year. So we also dive under the water to do that. And I mentioned the switching of the blades. So that grease is also important for adjusting the propeller pitch. And that can also be done manually on some propellers. So you really need to know, well, it pays to know what kind of propeller you have and the pitch of your propeller. If that gets kind of complicated, which you would definitely need help for. The propeller, keeping it clean is really key. So going down, scrubbing all the grass off it. If it's got barnacles, that's going to slow down your performance. Prop speed is a real slippery coating that you put on your propeller. These guys have also put it on their rudder to stop growth and just keep it super smooth and good performance. Removing lines from your propeller is definitely, you have to. If you get a line of your propeller, it can drag your propeller shaft out. It can also rip your engines off your mount. So I'm always listening when the engine's running to just that sound. And if the engine ever lugs down, throw it into neutral. Have a mini scuba tank on our expedition boat. And that means we can go down for 3 or 4 minutes to scrub the prop or also to remove lines from the propeller. You have to have a dive certification, but this is just a small bottle that you just stick in your mouth to go down and for a small amount of time. Up in the Arctic, we thought we'd lost the propeller. We came into ice. The boat was just moving and heaving. We went to throw it forward to try and charge through. Nothing happened, but ice can't really power through it. We've now finished the 6 systems of the engine, and we're going to talk about the startup and operating procedures before startup, after startup, and while you're motoring. So before startup, 6-point checklist: check the oil level, check the coolant level. If you've got transmission, there's also a dipstick for that. So check the transmission level. Belt tension for your alternator, freshwater circ pump. Looking under the engine, make sure there's no major drips. And then you're sighting the rake or fuel filter to make sure there's no water in the fuel. After startup, you're monitoring your gauges, so the alternator output, water temperature, and the oil pressure for the engine, checking that there is water coming out the exhaust, listening for strange noises in case there's a line around the propeller, and then just generally sighting in the engine room to make sure there's no smoke and that nothing's fallen off, such as the air filter. There's nothing going amok in there. While you're motoring, every 10 minutes, scan the instruments, oil pressure, revs, and mainly for overheating as well. And the engine room, look hourly. And then there's this, what we call, and it's an Italian tune-up. Sorry for those Italians there, but basically an Italian tune-up is giving your engine 90% throttle for 5 to 10 minutes once every 4 hours if you're underway for a long period of time, or if you're just out for a short day before coming back to the marina, really rev up the engine and you're sort of blowing that soot out through the exhaust. Nigel Calder has a troubleshooting guide in his Diesel Marine Engines book. So you're just going through what may it be making the strange noises, or if there's low oil pressure, you can troubleshoot through there. Engine maintenance. Some engines have zincs. These are sacrificial zincs. As I mentioned, there's parts that corrode. With your oil check, you can check that, what's corroding in your engine. But instead of the engine wearing away, artificial zincs are put in so that the artificial zinc wears away first. Modern engines don't necessarily have zincs that corrode. So if your engine doesn't have it, don't be too perturbed. But if it does, you want to know where they are. It's just a pencil zinc, and you pull it out and plug and screw a new one back in. Mention the exhaust elbow. So you've got a mixture of cooling water coming through with the hot exhaust air, and they meet at quite a small junction, and that can clog up. Hence you do an Italian tune-up and try and blow that soot that's coming from out your exhaust, mixing with that seawater. You're trying to keep that airway, or that exhaust way, free of buildup of soot and contaminants. It can corrode out because it does get super hot where the two meet. So replacing that, it's a cutaway. And exhaustelbow.com make a less expensive part for a Yanmar than the original part. A siphon break in your engine if your engine is under the water. So most engines are lower in the boat for weight carrying capacity. And you'll need to then know if your engine has a siphon break. So it's just a vent that stops the water from back flooding through your engine. If it becomes blocked with salt water or just salt crystals, then your engine can flood. An option to having propeller shaft coming out the back of the boat is to have a sail drive. So the engine sits above this and out through the drive shaft and propeller. It has seals that need to be replaced every 5 to 7 years. And then the zincs also are on there as well that need to be replaced. Sail drive maintenance, the boat generally has to be hauled out because you can't do this underwater. So that's the disadvantage of sail drives, boat being hauled. So where can you do that? That's close to you, or if you're in a foreign port, and then servicing the sail drive. And your checks that you can get your mechanic to help you with. So I always are around when the mechanic comes because you're paying money. So I tend not to just let them loose on the boat by myself, and I'm watching and seeing what they're doing. First up is valve adjustment. So the valves that sit on top of the piston chamber have a clearance for that, and then they'll measure that with a feeler gauge and then adjust when the valves seat and how they close. Another thing is the alignment of the engine. So the engine sits on rubber feet, and after a while those feet compress and the engine sinks down and gets heavier, and you get binding at the shaft. So they'll loosen off the back of the coupling, measure that binding gap between the top and the bottom, and then check that your engine is in line. So you'll be then cranking it up on the feet of the engine. The engine mounts are adjustable with the bolts, so you can then raise the back end of the engine because it sits low, and then you're not getting full even pressure on your shaft. Little sexist here, I'm sorry, but I take care of my mechanics, send them a calendar from a pretty place, or a pretty calendar when I'm out voyaging, just to make sure that he's there when I need him. If I'm stuck in some foreign port, I can give him a call and say, hey, remember me? He's like, yeah, I do. And all good to go. If you're leaving a boat for a period of time, those of you up in Toronto and New York and all those places, winterizing your engine. And we've also done that with our engine on the expedition boat because it's sitting in New Zealand due to COVID. So that to winterize it, you're placing fresh water and coolant through it, letting it sit. So you're not letting it sit with the seawater in it. Taking care of the environment, avoiding spills. So doing everything you can to not have gunky bilges or pumping that overboard. Taking care of your waste oil, making sure it gets recycled, your batteries. Underneath the engine, if you can, put oil absorb sheets. So this allows you to see what drips are forming. You can see the pink there from your automatic transmission fluid. Sort of like a diaper under the engine is the way I tend to look at it. But you can then see those drips forming, but it also captures them. If your bilge is quite deep, or if you're doing a lot of engine work, or if something's really getting funky on your engine or bilge, put in a bilge cleaner and then an oil absorb pad, but then pump it out by hand. Just don't run your bilge pump and get that contaminated water into the ocean. On to our last topic, and that's evaluating an older engine. And these are the two things that you ask yourself. How quickly does it start up? And how much oil is the engine using? So when starting up, you want to be able to just basically look at your engine and will it to go. So if it's just going dun, 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 and it's coughing and it's not starting up, could be time to either get a mechanic in to help you, or it could be time to change it out. And then how much oil is it using? Is it burning a lot of oil? Are you filling it up every time you run the engine? Lubricator does a problem solving if it's burning blue, black, or white in your exhaust. This is getting quite complicated. What is it going to cost to repower? Basically, engine replacement costs the price of the engine, and then that again to get the engine installed. So you're maybe changing the engine mounts, you may be changing the alignment of the engine due to the engine mounts. So just that cost of installing it, hooking everything up. But modern engines are quieter. Often the replacement parts are cheaper and they're smaller. Better Marine do an amazing job with engines. They can configure things such as you want the dipstick on the left or on the port or starboard side of the engine. Really work with you to get a new engine that you want. I mean, as I said, earlier on, they painted it white. What you want to be aware of is that you don't have a high pressure common rail engine. They're really sensitive to fuel. They run under super, super high pressure. So even if you're working on it and you do something wrong, you're going to get injected with really high pressure of fuel and you can die. You're dead. And they're also computer controlled. So do not go working on your engine if it is a high pressure common rail engine. 20-year-old engine heading offshore has an 8-point checklist. Compression, so how quickly does it fire up? Fuel injectors, starter motor and alternator, so they're the brains of the engine. The heat exchanger, oil and transmission coolers, so making sure they're all running. Replace the engine mount so the engine's not sagging. The exhaust elbow so that it's blowing stuff out the exhaust. The shaft and the stern bearings, because often if your shaft's corroded, I mean, you've done all this work on the engine, but people tend to not sometimes forget to pull the whole shaft out because it's living in an environment where it can be corrosive, or it is corrosive. And then the damper drive plate is the switch between the gearing of the engine. I had to replace this in a very small port in a very, the Cook Islands. It's tiny. It was a rough, stormy day. We couldn't get the mechanic out from New Zealand. We could get the part though, so it meant taking the back end of the engine. Long story. Yes, I love engines. What you do to save money. As I mentioned, the newer engines are smaller. So now I've got 3 drying lines on the expedition boat. So that makes for a great place to dry the tea towels, having nice engine room. It's warm in there when the engine's running. Perfect for drying your tighty whities. Toys. As I mentioned, there's tools, and then there's things that make life a little easier, such as a telescoping magnet, really good lighting. So having a headlamp so you can go and inspect things, and then a flexible hose clamp driver. I don't have it in this picture, but it allows you to tighten hose clamps on weird angles. What's shown on the bottom of this picture is a pickup stick. So if you have a deep bilge, when you drop things underneath the engine, you can go down with a little pick stick or a little claw and pick up bolts or things that drop down. Yeah, I had a duck. I was keeping him warm in the engine room. This is up in Tromsø, Norway. And he jumped out of his box and ended up underneath the engine, peeping away. Little guy. If you want to understand how engines work, you can buy this little model working engine and put it together. It's a kit set. So you get to see the chambers all going. You get to see the drive of the engine, belts. Kind of cool for $40. The books I mentioned were Diesels Afloat by Pat Manley, Nigel Calder, Diesel or Marine Diesel Engines. Awesome book. Oh, and you want to have the resource manual, the shop manual, and the parts manual if you're heading out for a long term on your boat or really want to get hands-on with your engine. I want to thank you for watching. Wish you all calm horizons, Toronto and beyond, and the world, since this is an international boat show. I'm here in New Zealand, busy working. So if you have any questions, you can contact me through the boat show or check me out online with Great Escape Sailing in New Zealand. So cheers and thank you very much, everybody. And we will stop the show. Bye.